Okay, Chapter 6, A New Direction. And the picture she has is Paul and John in Rishikesh, India, 1968. I didn't take many photos while we were there, but I treasure the ones I did. It was the most enlightening time of my life. George was away on tour yet again, and I was sitting with my friend Marie-Lise at the kitchen table in Kinfons. It was February 1967, and we had the Sunday papers spread out in front of us. I had a yearning to take up chanting, meditation, or something spiritual. I suppose after the experience of India, and she felt much the same. Something was missing from our lives, we decided. So there we were, combing through the papers when we came upon an advert for transcendental meditation classes in London. Perfect. Off we went to Caxton Hall and enrolled in the spiritual regeneration movement. In the course of a long weekend, we were initiated and given our mantras. TM is an ancient Indian practice that was brought to the West in the 1950s by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi as a means of ultimately achieving enlightenment. It is a simple technique. You are given a mantra, a single word, which you keep secret to say over and over again to yourself. The idea is that in repeating the mantra, you clear your mind so you can give it and your body a brief rest from the stress of modern life. You sit with your eyes closed, completely relaxed for 20 minutes, repeating your mantra to make yourself feel calmer, more creative, focused, and more successful. The benefits are cumulative. Day by day, life is supposed to get better and better. I loved meditating, and I found the effects remarkable. I really did feel more alert and energetic. It did what it said on the bottle. It was life-changing. I couldn't wait to tell George. As soon as he came home, I bombarded him with what I had been doing, and he was really interested. Then, joy of joys, I discovered that Maharishi was coming to London in August to give a lecture at the Hilton Hotel. I was desperate to go, and George said he would come too. Paul had already heard of him and was interested, and in the end we all went. George, John, Paul, Jane, Ringo, and I. Maharishi was every bit as impressive as I thought he would be, and we were spellbound. At the end we went to speak to him, and he said we must go to Wales, where he was running a 10-day summer conference of the spiritual regeneration movement in Bangor. It started in 2 days' time. We leaped at it. I persuaded my sister Jenny to join us. Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull came, also Cynthia Lennon. John had been doing an awful lot of drugs, which Cynthia didn't like, and I think she was worried about the effect they were having on him and about their marriage. When he came back from the Hilton lecture, full of enthusiasm about Maharishi, who was against drugs, I think she hoped it might lead to something she could share. Maharishi said that through meditation you could attain a natural high, more powerful than any a drug could give you. Maureen had just had a baby, so she couldn't come. We were traveling to Bangor in the same train as Maharishi and caught it by the skin of our teeth. We had traveled up from Surrey in John's Rolls-Royce and arrived at Paddington to find pandemonium at the station. Hundreds of people, passengers, press, police, photographers, and fans, and we were on our own. For the first time, Brian was not in charge, and although he had sent his assistant, Peter Brown, to see us off, we were like children allowed into the park with no nanny. John said it was like going somewhere without your trousers on. Brian had seemed interested in what Maharishi had to offer, but it was a bank holiday weekend, and he was committed to spending it with friends at his house in Sussex. He said he would join us later. Neil Aspinall and Mal Evans, the two roadies who had looked after the Beatles since the Cavern Club days and went everywhere with them, were not there either, so we had to carry our own baggage and fight our way through the crowds onto the platform. In the rush, Cynthia was left behind. She was probably carrying the suitcases, while John, empty-handed and thoughtless as ever, made a dash for it. And so the train pulled away, and I shall never forget the sight of Cynthia running down the platform, shrieking at John to wait. But Peter Brown arranged for Neil Aspinall to drive her to Bangor in his car, and she arrived not long after the rest of us. On the way down, John, George, Paul, and Ringo signed autographs for fans, and we went to see Maharishi in his first-class compartment. He was sitting cross-legged on the seat, which one of his followers had covered with a white sheet, and seemed to be doing an awful lot of giggling. He was a rather round little man in a white robe, with long hair and a big beard that was white at the tip. He had no idea who the Beatles were, simply that they were very famous, but he promised that TM, in which he would initiate them at Bangor, was simply a method of reaching a spiritual state, and that his meditation had to be practiced for just half an hour every morning. Then it was like a bank. No need to carry all your money around with you. You'd pop in now and then and take out what you wanted. What if you're greedy, asked John, and have another half hour's meditation after lunch, then slip in another half hour after tea? Everyone laughed. When the train pulled into the little seaside station at Bangor, hundreds of people were waiting, a combination of screaming fans and press. We wanted to go on to a stop further along the line and take a taxi back to avoid the inevitable scrum, but Maharishi insisted we stay close to him. He marched up to the press and agreed to hold a conference that afternoon, little realizing, I think, who the press were actually interested in. When we were shown to our rooms in the teacher training college, where the conference was being held, I felt as though I was back at boarding school, Spartan dormitories with the regulation chest of drawers and line on the floor. That night we went to Bangor in search of a restaurant and found the only one that was open late, the Chinese. Fine, we went in. A couple of hours and many bottles of wine later, we discovered that none of us had enough money to pay the bill. We weren't used to paying restaurant bills, or any others for that matter. The next day, Maharishi gave an introductory seminar to his 300 or so devotees, seated cross-legged on the floor, and afterward the impromptu press conference took place. Reporters were swarming all over the college, and there was no one to keep them in check. I am sure they had little idea who Maharishi was, and perhaps thought the Beatles were pulling a stunt. But the Beatles said that not only were they deadly serious, they were no longer going to take drugs in accordance with Maharishi's teaching. Just a month before, they had put their names to a petition in the Times calling for cannabis to be legalized. It was an experience we went through, said Paul. Now it's over. We don't need it anymore. We think we're finding new ways of getting there. The petition had been in protest at Mick Jagger and Keith Richards receiving custodial sentences after the infamous drug raid on Redlands, Keith's house in Sussex, in May. The previous Sunday, the News of the World had run a story that quoted Mick Jagger admitting he had frequently taken drugs. The paper had made an expensive mistake. It wasn't Mick who'd been overheard talking in a nightclub, it was Brian Jones, and Mick sued for libel. The following week, acting on a tip-off, the police raided the house in the early hours of the morning, knowing that Mick Jagger was there and drugs were in the house. The tip-off, it transpired, had come from the News of the World. George and I had been at Redlands that evening. Marianne Faithfull was there, and also Robert Fraser. There was an American drug dealer, too, known as the Acid King, and a few others. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, George and I drove home. No sooner had we left than 30 policemen burst into the house with a warrant to search it for drugs. Drugs were still new, and the police were still quite naive. Robert Fraser produced a bottle of pills from his coat pocket, which he said had been prescribed by his doctor for a stomach problem. An officer said he had better take a few to have them tested. He left Robert with about 24. They were pure heroin. They also found amphetamines and cannabis. Keith, Mick, and Robert were arrested and spent a night in the Lewis jail. That Sunday, the News of the World had the entire story, including the detail that, quote, a famous couple had left earlier, end quote. They had obviously been waiting for us to go, presumably so that a Beatle wouldn't be implicated. Robert went to jail for 6 months for possessing heroin. Mick was sentenced to 3 months for possessing 4 pep pills, which he had bought legally in Italy, and Keith got 9 months for allowing cannabis to be smoked on his property. Mick did 1 night of his sentence before he was bailed. Keith spent 3 at Her Majesty's pleasure, and came out saying he intended to prosecute the Queen for allowing cannabis to be smoked on her property. He had been offered 6 joints in prison, and, quote, they were fab, end quote. When word got out that the tip-off had come from the News of the World, fans stormed the newspaper building and hurled Molotov cocktails. The Times, not noted as the most liberal of newspapers, attacked the judiciary in an editorial written by the editor, William Rees Mogg, under the headline, "Who Breaks a Butterfly on a Wheel?" Drugs were part of our lives at that time, and they were fun. We didn't take anything hard. None of us used heroin, and we'd had no idea that Robert did. But we took acid regularly. Everyone did, and it was perfectly legal. We also took uppers and downers and smoked cannabis. Our dentist, John Riley, had turned us on to acid. He and his girlfriend invited John, Cynthia, George, and me to dinner at his house in Hyde Park Square, and one evening sometime in 1965. We knew him quite well and had been to a few clubs with him in the past. The 4 of us went to London in my little Mini Cooper S. George had bought me a fabulous orange one for my birthday. We had a lovely meal, plenty to drink, and at the end George said, "Let's go." We were planning to see some friends playing at the Pickwick Club. John Riley's girlfriend jumped to her feet. "You can't," she said. "You haven't had any coffee yet. It's ready. I've made it, and it's delicious." We sat down again and drank the coffee she was insistent we should have. But then we were really keen to get away, and John Lennon said, "We must go now. These friends of ours are going to be on soon. It's their first night. We've got to go and see them." And John Riley said, "You can't leave." "What are you talking about?" said John Lennon. "You've just had LSD." "No, we haven't." "Yes, you have," said our host. "It was in the coffee." John Lennon was absolutely furious. "How dare you fucking do this to us," he said. George and I said, "Do what?" We didn't know what LSD was. John was the only one of us who knew because he had read about it in Playboy. He said, "It's a drug." And as it began to take effect, we felt even more strongly that we didn't want to be there. I wondered if the dentist, who hadn't had any coffee, had given it to us hoping the evening might end in an orgy. We were desperate to escape. John Riley said he would drive us, and we should leave our car with him. "No," we said. We piled into my Mini, which seemed to be shrinking, and drove to the club where our friends were playing. All the way the car felt smaller and smaller, and by the time we arrived, we were completely out of it. People kept recognizing George and coming up to him. They were moving in and out of focus, then looked like animals. We clung to each other, feeling surreal. Soon we moved on to the Ad Lib Club. We knew it and thought we might feel better if we were in familiar surroundings. It wasn't far from the Pickwick, so we walked, and on the way I remember trying to break a shop window. The Ad Lib was on the top floor, above the Prince Charles Theatre in Leicester Place, and we thought the lift was on fire because there was a little red light inside. As the doors opened, we crawled out and bumped into Mick Jagger, Marianne Faithfull, and Ringo. John told them we'd been spiked. The effect of the drug was getting stronger and stronger, and we were all in hysterics and crazy. When we sat down, the table elongated. Hours later, we decided to go home. We climbed into the car again, and this time George drove, at no more than 10 miles an hour, concentrating hard, all the way to Esher. But it felt as though he was doing 1,000 miles an hour, and I saw some goalposts and said, "Let's jump out and play football." The journey took hours, and it was daylight by the time we got home. We went into Kinfon's and locked the gate so that the cleaner wouldn't come in and find us, put the cat into a room on her own, and sat down. The drug took about 8 hours to wear off, but it was very frightening, and we never spoke to the dentist again. George said it was if I had never tasted, talked, seen, thought, or heard properly before. For the first time in my whole life, I wasn't conscious of ego. I had always thought John Riley was rather odd. No matter what he was going to do in our mouths, he would give us intravenous Valium. All of the Beatles went to him, and we took it for granted that this was what happened. No one questioned it. We would go into a deep sleep and wake up not knowing what he had done. I watched him trying to revive George once by slapping his face. It was sinister. He could have been doing anything to us while we were out. After that experience, acid became a part of the creative process for the Beatles. They had been taking other pills since Hamburg days. George used to tell me how they had to play for hours on end, and to stop them falling asleep, the nightclub owner used to feed them pills. At the time, we thought nothing of it. We didn't consider that they might be harmful. They were just fun. They could be scary, but most of the time they made us feel like $1 million, see wonderful psychedelic images, and hear everything much more acutely. George used to say that when he took LSD, he felt as though a light bulb had gone on in his head. Every sensation was heightened. The police didn't share our view. I think the establishment felt they were losing control, that the young were being corrupted by their decadent, long-haired hippie heroes. A lot of the Beatles' songs were clearly drug-induced, but the Beatles were clean-cut. Everyone loved them, even our parents' generation. The Rolling Stones were the bad boys, overtly sexy, dissolute, and dangerous. If only they had known. In the summer of 1967, George was working in Los Angeles for a couple of months. We rented a house on Blue Jay Way and met so many fantastic people. Joni Mitchell came over and invited me to hang out with her while George was busy. She was great fun and took me to a studio belonging to a friend of hers where she and some other musicians sat down and played together. One day, David Crosby of the Byrds invited us to his place in the hills. We arrived to find a swimming pool full of naked people. Not knowing anyone or indeed what to do, we went into the house until David arrived naked with a joint in his hand. He soon realized we were not going to join in, so he put on his shorts. Next thing, the pool attendant arrived and didn't bat an eyelid, got on with his job. L.A. is wild, I thought. Most exciting of all, one evening we were invited to meet the great Frank Sinatra. We turned up at the studio where he was recording, and through the glass wall of the control room, watched while he sang My Way, accompanied by a full orchestra. At the end of the song, he came out to hear it back and meet George. We were then ushered into limos and driven down Sunset Boulevard to a restaurant. We glided in as smooth as silk and sat at a table, already prepared with a bottle of whiskey or bourbon in front of each of Frank's crew, all short, wide men in large suits. I found the ones I sat next to very difficult to understand. We also went to see my sister Jenny, who was living with a friend in San Francisco. We flew there in a private Learjet with Derek Taylor and Neil Aspinall, and were met by a limo, then picked up Jenny and went to have lunch. Afterward, we thought it would be fun to go and have a look at Haight-Ashbury, the district that had been taken over by the hippies. Musicians like Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead, and Janis Joplin lived there, and it was the LSD capital of the world, of America. On the way, Derek produced a tab. Would we like some? Since we were going to Haight-Ashbury, it seemed silly not to. The area is named after the intersection of two streets, Haight and Ashbury, and as we approached, the driver said he wouldn't drive down the street itself, he'd park among the side streets. It seemed a little odd, but we didn't argue. We got out of the car, the acid kicked in, and everything was just, whoa, psychedelic and it was just completely fine. We went into a shop and noticed that all these people were following us. They had recognized George as we walked past them in the street, then turned to follow us. 1 minute there were 5, then 10, 20, 30, and 40 people behind us. I could hear them saying, "The Beatles are here, the Beatles are in town." We were expecting Haight-Ashbury to be special, a creative and artistic place, filled with beautiful people, but it was horrible. full of ghastly dropouts, bums, and spotty youths, all out of their brains. Everybody looked stoned, even mothers and babies. And they were so close behind us, they were treading on the backs of our heels. It got to the point where we couldn't stop for fear of being trampled. Then somebody said, "Let's go to Hippie Hill." And we crossed the road, hoping the lights were red, and went into the park. Then somebody said, "Let's sit down here." And we all sat down on the grass, our retinue facing us, as if we 6 were on stage. They looked at us expectantly, as if George was some kind of messiah. We were so high, and then the inevitable happened. A guitar emerged from the crowd, and I could see it being passed to the front by outstretched arms. I thought, "Oh God, poor George, this is a nightmare." Finally, the guitar was handed to him. I had the feeling that they'd listened to the Beatles records, analyzed them, learned what they'd thought they should learn, and taken every drug they'd thought the Beatles were singing about. Now they wanted to know where to go next, and George was there, obviously, to give them the answer. Pressure. George was so cool. He said, "This is G, this is E, this is D," and showed them a few chords, then handed back the guitar and said, "Sorry, man, we've got to go now." He didn't sing. He couldn't have. He was flying. We all were. I was surprised he could do even that. Anyway, we got up and walked back towards our limo, at which point I heard a little voice say, "Hey, George, do you want some STP?" George turned around and said, "No thanks, I'm cool, man." Then the bloke turned around and said to the others, "George Harrison turned me down." And they went, "No." And then the crowd became faintly hostile. We sensed it because when you're that high, you're very aware of vibes, and we were walking faster and faster, and they were following. When we saw the limo, we ran across the road and jumped in, and they ran after us and started to rock the car, and the windows were full of these faces flattened against the glass, looking at us. That was a turning point for George. We had always thought of drugs as fun, a means of expanding your mind and consciousness. What we saw at Haight-Ashbury was an eye-opener. Those people had dropped out, were sleeping rough, and taking all kinds of drugs, some of which were 10 times stronger than LSD. STP was one, as George later discovered, from Mama Cass Elliot. There was nothing remotely artistic or creative about those people. They were like alcoholics or any other kind of addict, and it turned George right off the whole drug culture. He stopped taking LSD and took up meditation. So Maharishi and his teachings had come into our lives at the right moment, or at least into George's life, and not just by providing an alternative to drugs. George was unsure why he was so famous. He knew he was a talented musician, but he also knew that there were dozens of talented musicians, some more talented than him, yet he was the one who was world famous, who couldn't walk in the street without being mobbed or sit in a restaurant without someone pestering him for an autograph. He was looking for an explanation, and Maharishi offered a practical way of accessing the spirituality and mysticism he had glimpsed on our trip to India with Ravi Shankar. By Sunday morning in Bangor, everyone had been initiated into transcendental meditation and believed we had found a new way of living. Then the telephone rang, and the world turned upside down. Brian Epstein was dead. It was the most shocking, dreadful moment. Paul took Peter Brown's call. Brian had been found dead in his bed at his house in Chapel Hill. He was 32 years old. At that point, there was no explanation. We were stunned when Paul, ashen-faced, repeated what he had been told. It had to be a mistake. Paul and George were in complete shock. I don't think it could have been worse if they had heard that their own fathers had dropped dead. The unthinkable had happened. Brian had found them, believed in them, molded them, turned them into millionaires, and made them famous the world over. He had looked after them, pandered to their every whim, protected them, guided them, advised them. He was their friend, their enabler, their hero. He was irreplaceable. We knew in the cold, hard light of a Bangor morning that life would never be the same again. We were outside just after breakfast when we heard the news. We had been on our way to Maharishi, who was going to talk to us privately, and suddenly that seemed the right thing to do, so we kept the appointment. We needed someone wise and spiritual to tell us what to think. We were lost. I even thought idiotically, Maharishi is so amazing, maybe he can bring Brian back to life. He couldn't, of course, but he was calm. He talked about reincarnation, but he said, too, that negative feelings would impede Brian's journey. His spirit was with us, and to release it, we must be joyful for him. Laugh and be happy. It was hard to feel any joy that day, but it was an enormous help to have someone to turn to who knew with such certainty how we should cope. I can't help thinking it was no coincidence that we were with Maharishi when Brian died. Someone up there was looking after us. Brian had died of an overdose of a bromide-based drug that he had been taking to help him sleep. The police inspector called to the house after Brian's secretary, housekeeper, and doctor had broken down the locked bedroom door and discovered the body, reported finding 17 bottles of pills in his bathroom cabinet, his briefcase, and beside his bed. The question was whether he had died on purpose. We knew that Brian took sleeping pills. He took all sorts of drugs and drank far more than was good for him, but we all did. However, you shouldn't drink alcohol on top of sleeping pills. It was suggested that Brian had taken some pills, woken up later and drunk something, then taken more pills, forgetting what he had already swallowed. I cannot believe he committed suicide. On the other hand, I don't think he was happy, and fundamentally probably never had been. He was gay, and I think he found it difficult. He was attracted to the wrong sort of people, rough trade who would treat him badly, then leave him. Much of the time he was lonely and depressed. For all their closeness, he had never really socialized with the Beatles. He had held mad, wild, mind-blowing parties at his house in Belgravia and at Kingsley Hill, his country house near Heathfield in Sussex, to which we had all gone. But for most of the time he left us to do our own thing, and we left him to do his. We had noticed that he had become a little loose in his social life. I got the feeling he no longer cared about anything as much as he once had. The year before, George and I had been to the south of France with him again for a week, and that had been typical of the old perfectionist Brian. He had every little detail worked out, each meal, each restaurant, each place we would visit. He even laid on a plane to take us to a bullfight in Arles, A-R-L-E-S. But in the last year of his life, when our lives changed so dramatically, he had let things go. We knew he was taking far more drugs than were good for him, but we didn't know that he was spending most days in bed, only emerging from his flat at night, or that he had scarcely been seen in the office for months. I suppose we were so absorbed in our own lives as children 8 that we didn't stop to wonder how Daddy was, as children are. I suppose we were so absorbed in our own lives as children are that we didn't stop to wonder how Daddy was. I don't know whether any of us cried when we heard the news that Sunday morning, but I know I did during the memorial service at the New London Synagogue in St. John's Wood a few weeks later. We didn't go to the funeral, which was family only in Liverpool, but George sent a single sunflower, and Brian's business partner, Nat Weiss, threw it into the open grave. At the memorial, his mother, Queenie, looked frail and broken. Her husband, Brian's father, had died a little over a month before. Wow. Already George was full of Maharishi's teachings. There is no such thing as death, he said to reporters that Sunday morning in Bangor. Only in the physical sense. We know he's okay now. He will return because he was striving for happiness and desired bliss so much. And a little later he said much the same thing. There's no such thing as death anyway. I mean, it's death on a physical level, but life goes on everywhere. George found it comforting to believe that Brian's soul would be back one day, and I agreed with him. The real sadness for Brian, I think, was that when the Beatles stopped touring, they no longer needed him so much. And in August 1967, when he died, they hadn't been touring or done a live performance for a year. For a long time, they had hated playing to vast, screaming audiences. But the crunch had come in Manila at the end of a tour of Germany, Japan, and the Philippines. Brian Epstein and Peter Brown had been having breakfast in the coffee shop of their hotel in Tokyo when someone came to tell them that Mrs. Marcos, the wife of the Philippines president, wanted to invite the Beatles to lunch during their visit to her country. Brian said, "We don't do that. We don't go to official functions." This was because the last time they had gone to one at the British Embassy in Washington in 1964, it had been a fiasco. It was after a concert at the Coliseum, their first on American soil, and the embassy was swarming with reporters as well as guests. Everyone had had too much to drink and kept grabbing the Beatles to demand autographs. Someone cut off a chunk of Ringo's hair. Then John swore and walked out. Brian had decided that in the future they would do nothing that he hadn't arranged. When the Beatles flew into Manila, their bags were confiscated. They were terrified they would be busted for carrying drugs. Their fears were unfounded. The day after the concert, someone arrived at their hotel and said he had come to take them to the palace for lunch. Brian explained that they had declined the invitation. "But you have to go," said the emissary. Brian was adamant that they would not, whereupon he received a call from the British ambassador suggesting he reconsider. Brian dug in his heels, and they didn't leave the hotel. All the while the story on national television, which George and the others were watching in their suite, was that the Beatles were expected at the palace but had not yet shown up. Then as time passed, the news became Beatles snub first family. The next morning they were due to leave and woke to find that all security had been removed. There was no room service and every facility was unavailable. There was no car or taxi to take them to the airport. Eventually they found two vehicles. Neil, Moll, and Tony Barrow, the Beatles press officer, went in one, and the Beatles, Brian, and Peter in another. When they arrived at the airport, no one would help with the bags, and the crowd was booing. The young people were screaming and trying to grab them, but the older ones were punching them, throwing bricks, and kicking them. When they found their way to the right gate, they were put into a glass room on display to people on the mezzanine floor. The security people who had confiscated their bags on the way into the country came in to shove them around. The thugs were wearing guns, and the Beatles' entourage were frightened. When Moll, a big bloke, was knocked over, it turned nasty. They were leaving on a KLM flight to India and were worried that would take off before they could get on board. On the plane, finally, a call went out for Mr. Epstein and Mr. Evans to get off. Brian sorted it out, but it cost him everything the group had earned in Manila. The stress brought him out in hives. That was when George said he never wanted to go on tour again. Being mobbed because people loved you was one thing. Being mobbed because they hated you was another. The only good thing that came out of Manila was the beautiful emerald ring George brought home for me with some gorgeous black pearls. The last live performance they gave was at Candlestick Park, San Francisco, in August 1966. From then on, the Beatles wrote songs and recorded albums, and Brian's role changed. He had never been needed in the recording studio. That was the domain of George Martin, the Beatles' record producer. Although they still relied on him to fix and arrange things in their personal lives, his day-to-day contact with them diminished. He had plenty of other people to look after, but the Beatles were becoming independent. Brian's empire, NEMS Enterprises, was huge, and he had signed up many other artists, including Cilla Black, Jerry and the Pacemakers, and Billy J. Kramer. But the Beatles were special. For 5 years they had been his life, and suddenly they were almost gone. Shortly after Brian's death, a couple wrote to George and John saying that Brian was trying to make contact with us. The wife was a medium and could conduct a seance. But, they said, it was vitally important that we told no one about it because some Venusians would join us, and if anyone got wind of their visit, the military would try to kill them. There had been a lot of sightings of Venusians recently, they said, and they would be traveling in their V6 spaceship. We thought this sounded exciting, so John, Cynthia, George, and I drove to East Grinstead in West Sussex, where the couple had converted an enormous country house into a health spa. While we waited for the Venusians to arrive, the wife explained that she had previously lived in London. One day a little person had appeared in the window and said, "You have been sent here to help people whenever you can." So she and her husband had bought the house and turned it into a health spa to fulfill her destiny. We waited and waited. There was no sign of the Venusians. Were we sure we hadn't told anyone? Yes. Then the husband sat in front of a big old-fashioned radio, like something out of a 1940s movie, put on earphones and fiddled with some knobs saying things like V6, V6, come in V6. Then the husband sat, the Venusians, he announced, had said they weren't coming after all, but they would contact us at another time. He and his wife were so disappointed, but we dared not look at each other for fear of cracking up. We were ushered into a big dark room where we sat around a circular table. Suddenly the wife was talking in a weird voice as though she had been taken over by a spirit. She talked about people on the other side, people who were coming forward who wanted to speak to us. She had Brian with her, she said. He was saying he was all right. We were not to worry about him, and he wanted us to know that he had not committed suicide. I so wanted to believe her, and so did George, I think. But she got a few things wrong for me. She was pretty accurate on the things she told Cynthia, but John poo-pooed the whole thing. When it was over, the spirits had left her. She looked drained. When it was over and the spirits had left her, she looked drained. Her husband told us that because the Venusians hadn't come, they wouldn't charge us, and we said goodbye. Outside, we howled with laughter. When Brian's death cut short our time in Bangor, Maharishi had invited us to stay with him at his ashram in India. Every year he held a course for Westerners who wanted to become TM instructors. None of us did, but we wanted to study it some more. And I think the Beatles thought their fans might copy them, which meant they would be using their influence on young people in a good way. In February 1968, with half the world's press, we set off for Rishikesh, a small town in the north of India in the foothills of the Himalayas. Short though it had been, the experience in Wales had filled us with excitement about where Maharishi and Indian spirituality might lead. George and I, my sister Jenny, John, and Cynthia flew out to Delhi together, and Paul, Jane, Ringo, and Maureen arrived a few days later. When we had been there for 4 weeks, Magic Alex arrived. He was a young Greek who had attached himself to the Beatles, and Jenny was renting a room in his house. His name was Alex Mardas, and his father was one of the Greek colonels who had overthrown King Constantine in the 1967 coup d'etat. He had invented some weird electrical gadgets that appealed to the Beatles, John in particular, and made things for the Apple Boutique, which had opened just before we left for India. At one time he was keen that the Beatles should buy a Greek island, so we went to Greece and stayed on a boat, hopping from island to island. All I remember about the holiday is that some of us took acid and we didn't have to go through passport control because Alex's father was so important. Jenny was coming to Rishikesh with us partly because she and I loved doing things together, and partly because, coincidentally, while George and I had been discovering Indian philosophy with Ravi Shankar, Jenny had been going through a similar process at home. She had just broken up with Mick Fleetwood and was missing him and us when she decided that the beliefs with which she had grown up made no sense anymore. One day she had come across a shop off the Charing Cross Road that was full of books on Eastern philosophy. When she had seen what they were saying about life, death, and reincarnation, she had suddenly recognized that God was everywhere, inside each one of us, and that everything was a circle. When we got back from India, she told us what had happened to her. We, of course, had had exactly the same experience. At that time, Jenny and I seemed to know exactly what the other was thinking. We often dreamed about each other, and 8 out of 10 times we would phone and discover that what had gone on in the dream had happened in real life. It was quite uncanny, a time of psychic closeness between us. Our simultaneous move towards Eastern philosophy was an extension of this. Our lives were also running in parallel. Jenny had left school and become a model, as I had. Occasionally we worked together, which was fun. But where I was almost exclusively a photographic model, she worked in-house for a designer, so the opportunities for us to do so were rare. She too had fallen in love with the musician. Mick Fleetwood was the drummer in Fleetwood Mac. So Jenny was part of the rock and roll scene as I was. Their recent split was not permanent. Her relationship with Mick was always on and off. He had first seen her when she was 15 at the coffee mill at Notting Hill, where she and her friends used to go after school, and had decided then that he would marry her. She was 17 when they started going out together, and they married in 1970 when Jenny was 23. The plan was that we would stay at the Academy of Meditation in Rishikesh for 2 or 3 months. It was a long time for me to be out of circulation as a model, but George had never liked me working, and I was making an effort to cut down on the jobs I took. I never knew quite what it was about that he disliked. I suspect he was simply a product of his upbringing and wanted his wife to be at home with the kids, waiting for him with the meal on the table when he came in from work. My career took me away from home and out of his bed at an ungodly hour. It made other men look at me, which he might not have liked. He was quite chauvinistic. And perhaps he worried that if I became more famous, it would fuel the public interest in us that he was always trying to escape. But when I gave up modeling, I lost an important part of my identity, my feeling of self-worth, my independence, and my self-confidence. From Delhi, we took taxis for the 6-hour journey to Rishikesh. The road was full of bicycles and ox carts, donkeys, and sacred cows. It was a hodgepodge of noise, and the smell of dung and spices hung in the air. As we left the city, the dust rose, and through it, we saw women working in the fields in bright saris, red and yellow, purple and green. We passed fields of wheat, mountains and rivers. It was an amazing drive. Rishikesh nestles beside the Ganges, at the point where the river cascades out of the Himalayas into the plains. The ashram was at the top of a hill, overlooking the town and the river. The air was clear and clean and filled with the scent of flowers. It was about 8 or 10 acres, surrounded by a high perimeter fence and padlocked gates. Inside we were shown Maharishi's little bungalow, the post office, a communal dining area, a lecture theater, and a series of stone chalets where we stayed. They had flat roofs on which we sunbathed. Maharishi and the elders greeted us, and we were shown to our rooms. Initially, George and I shared one. It was sparsely furnished, with 2 skimpy beds, but we kept disturbing each other in our meditation, so we ended up with a room each. John and Cynthia were next door to us to begin with, but they were not getting on well. John had met Yoko Ono, and after a week or 2, he moved into a room on his own. I felt so sorry for Cynthia. He received notes from Yoko in the post almost every day, saying things like, "If you look up at the sky and see a cloud, it's me sending you love." Every day was much the same. We would wake in the morning to the piercing sound of peacocks calling and go to breakfast in an open dining area, covered with canvas held aloft on bamboo sticks. The cooks were a couple of 21-year-old Australian boys who were on their way around the world and had heard the Academy needed help. Everything they cooked was vegetarian and delicious. It reminded me of the chapatis and beans the Kikuyu had made in Kenya. They produced porridge and toast for breakfast, which we would eat, watched by hundreds of big black crows in the trees. They were waiting for us to leave so they could swoop down and peck at our leftovers. Sometimes monkeys jumped onto the tables, grabbed a handful of food, and bounded off. Ringo had spent years in hospital as a child. He couldn't eat onions, garlic, or anything spicy, so had brought with him a suitcase of Heinz baked beans. After breakfast, we were given our itinerary for the day, which mostly amounted to meditating and attending lectures given by Maharishi. These were held in a large covered area with a platform that was always covered with flowers when he spoke. For me, one of the greatest revelations was the concept of reincarnation, which he espoused. It hadn't occurred to me that there might be a continuation of life in a different sphere. I had thought that when we died, that was it. Over the years, as friends have died, this belief has been a great consolation to me. There were probably about 60 of us at the ashram, an interesting collection of people from across the world. Sweden, Britain, America, Germany, Denmark, and everyone was so nice. Despite that, we felt cut off from the rest of the world, so it was always exciting when letters came in the post. My mother wrote regularly with news of home, or when others joined us. One of the newcomers was Donovan, and his manager, Gypsy Dave. We had known Donovan for some years. He and the Beatles had recorded together, and he'd contributed to the Yellow Submarine album. He had fallen in love with Jenny, for whom he wrote Jennifer Juniper. Mike Love, lead singer of the Beach Boys, also turned up, as did the actress Mia Farrow with her brother Johnny and sister Prudence. Maharishi's lectures were fascinating. He talked about the ideas behind meditation and what we should be trying to achieve, about life and astral traveling, how this can happen when you're meditating. It's like an out-of-body experience, and it happened to me once at Rishikesh. I felt as if I was in one of the other rooms, then realized I was in my own. It happened to George, too, when we compared notes. Sometimes Maharishi gave our group private lessons, just him and us, including Donovan, sitting out of doors. Afterwards, we would go to our rooms to meditate, at first for a limited time. Gradually, we were allowed to spend as long as we wanted meditating, and if we were going to do so during meal times, we had to let someone know so the food could be left outside the room. The longest I managed was 7 hours, from 5 in the afternoon to midnight. Every so often a tailor would appear, and we would get him to make clothes for us. We all wore pajama trousers and big baggy shirts, and the boys grew beards. It was baking hot during the day, so you had to wear loose flowing Indian clothes. After 4 in the afternoon it could get quite cold, and when it rained there was no hot water. One evening Maharishi organized boats to take everyone on a trip down the river while 2 holy men chanted. Then George and Donovan started to sing, and we all joined in with the mixture of English and German songs. It was so beautiful, with mountains on 3 sides of us. In the setting sun, the one to the west turned a deep, deep pink. George, John, and Paul wrote several songs while we were there. Several went into the White Album, and Donovan taught them his finger-picking technique on the guitar. Someone was always playing a guitar, and there would be discussions and singing, a nice little hubbub of social activity. And if it was anyone's birthday, and there was a surprising number while we were there, including George's 25th and my 24th, there would be cake and a party. At George's, everyone put red and yellow paint on their faces and wore garlands of flowers, and an Indian musician came to play for him. The same musician played on my birthday and gave me a beautiful dilruba, an Indian string instrument with a bird's head engraved at the neck. John drew me a picture of us all meditating and wrote "Happy Birthday, Pattie, love from John and Sin" on it. and Cynthia, who is an accomplished artist, made me a lovely painting. While the Beatles were recording the White Album, George wrote a song called Something, which he released as his first A-side single with the Beatles. He told me in a matter-of-fact way that he had written it for me. It was very beautiful, and it turned out to be the most successful song he ever wrote, with more than 150 cover versions. His favorite was the one by James Brown. Frank Sinatra said he thought it was the best love song ever written. My favorite was the one by George Harrison, which he played to me in the kitchen at Kinfon's. Prudence Farrow didn't have such a good time at the ashram. She overdid the meditating. We couldn't get her to come out of her room. She stayed in it for something like 2 weeks, as if she was in a trance. We took it in turns to visit and talk to her, but to no avail. She was trying to reach God faster than anyone else. We were worried, and so was Mia. Even Maharishi was concerned. When she finally came out, he told her she must meditate only in short bursts. John wrote a song for her, Dear Prudence, and the boys would stand outside her room and sing it to her. Ringo and Maureen only stayed 2 weeks. Maureen had a phobia about flies, which at the time I thought silly, and she couldn't have come to a worse place. There were all sorts of flying insects. Ringo looked so sad when they left, but I think they also missed their children, who were very young, and he was probably tired of baked beans. Paul and Jane left after about a month. Paul was keen to get back to London and Apple, the business the Beatles were about to launch. The Apple shop had opened just before we left, but there was an office to find and a new manager to replace Brian. He had always been more interested in business than the others, and I guess a month of meditating was enough for him. The two who were most engrossed in Maharishi's teachings were John and George. They would meditate for hours, and George was very focused. I loved meditating, but I can't sustain that sort of intensity for long. Sometimes I would leave George meditating and make a foray to Mussoorie and Dehradun, Tibetan trading posts. At that time, China was slowly taking over Tibet, whose people were being pushed out of their country as their culture was destroyed. I bought a few trinkets, a prayer wheel, and lots of pretty Tibetan beads, and sometimes I would walk down to the Ganges with a couple of friends. There were lepers on one side of the river begging, and a man sat in the middle meditating on a pointed rock. If I had seen lepers in Oxford Street, I'd have been upset. But in India, they and the man on the rock were just part of the scenery. As the days got hotter, the cool water in the river was delicious. It moved so fast that you could sit on it, quite literally, and it would take you along as if you were on a chute. George disapproved. He thought it far too frivolous. He never knew that one day when I was in the river, I lost my wedding ring. I panicked. George would be furious. Johnny Farrow was with me, and we looked and looked. I was convinced it was in vain. But miraculously, after about 20 minutes, he had it in his hand. Maybe it was a sign. And then everything went horribly wrong. Mia Farrow told John she thought Maharishi had been behaving inappropriately. I think he made a pass at her. John threw a hissy fit. Come on, we're leaving. Then Magic Alex claimed that Maharishi had tried something with the girl he had befriended. I am not sure how true that was. I think Alex wanted to get John away from Rishikesh. He seemed convinced that Maharishi was evil. He kept saying, it's black magic. And perhaps John had been waiting for an excuse to leave. He wanted to be with Yoko. Whatever the truth, they left. We stayed on, but the next night I had a horrid dream about Maharishi, and when George woke me the next morning, I said, come on, we're leaving. He, Jenny, and I went south to Madras. George didn't want waiting for him in England, the new business, finding a new manager, the fans, and the press. Instead, we went to see Ravi Shankar and lost ourselves in his music. That's the end of Chapter 6, A New Direction.